friends. Many people are familiar here to me and to each other. Some aren't. It's an international group I'm seeing here. We have people from New York City, we have people from Brazil, people from Malta, people from Gozo, people from New Mexico, Haiti originally. Yeah. And well, welcome to the first session in the Work in Progress seminar series. For those of you who are new to the series, who have never been here, this is held every year. It's one of the few things we have at the university which are interdisciplinary. There's no like home department for this. This is the brainchild of Professor Paul who cannot be with us. He's recovering. He was in hospital last week, so I think he was discharged. He will have to be discharged last weekend. So of course it will be sorely missed because he's always here. He'll be the one who normally opens the discussions, and well. It is our pleasure, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you a very good personal friend, but a person who has made a great contribution to critical pedagogy over the years. I don't say it because we're friends. She's one of the leading lights, leading exponents of critical pedagogy, and I would say also community leadership. All right, we've got others. Hispanic or Hispanic? All right. We can have Dutch presence. All right, see how international we are. Carmelo, I don't know how to decide whether it's Maltese, whether it's Spanish, whether it's whatever. Anyway, so I was saying, I don't know if you have the latest news on Paul. I was saying Paul cannot be with us. Paul was discharged last week. All right, is this okay? Okay, so now, it's a pleasure to introduce Antonia Darder. Antonia is originally from Puerto Rico, but she's a professor at Loyola University at Marymount in Los Angeles. I've known Antonia from our work on Paulo Freire and on critical pedagogy. She's one of the leading exponents of critical pedagogy. I think most of you know that she is because you've seen her work. One of her best books, I remember I was a student when I first was shown this book by Carmel. It's called Cultural Power in the Classroom. A 20th anniversary edition, 20 years later, another edition appeared, published by Paradigm this time. And another book of hers is Reinventing Paulo Freire Pedagogy of Love, which I enjoyed reading. And also a book which collects most of her papers. It's like a triptych book. Well, it's a greatest hits, sort of put it this way, called, which is what. This is the Leona, this is, sorry, the Antonia, sorry, there's a lapsus. This is the Antonia I know. She captures it, and dissident voice. Antonia is not just an academic, she has professionally supervised numerous students, about 90, that got their PhDs. She dedicates a lot of her time to her students. And of course, she's very active in the community. She's an activist. She also ran into trouble with certain authorities in certain institutions because of her principles. And I don't think she would mind my saying this. Anyway, there's an interview with Antonia where she lays bare her soul in a book called Public Intellectuals, Radical Democracies and Social Movements, just as there's an interview with Vince Caruana in the same book on social solidarity, economy, environment, etc. Anyway, without further ado, todo.
Hot, so I'm trying to figure out how I can talk and fan myself at the same time because I'm very, very warm. And actually, you know, when you go out to speak in different places, there's different expectations, and I realized that that I prepared a text, a paper to read. But at the same time, I'm feeling that, I mean, this is a beautiful paper and with a beautiful PowerPoint, but I'm not feeling that this is maybe the best forum to present a paper that's read. And that maybe what I would prefer to do, if you will indulge me and if you can feel confident that we will somehow, at the end of the hour, get to some place together on this, is to actually try to have a dialogue together about this question of leadership and issues of community empowerment. And that what I would try to do is to bring forth some of those principles, particularly related to the work of Freire, because it would be a mistake not to say that I am a Freire scholar, because I am a Freire scholar. My work begins with Freire, and part of what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to find ways to really capture the essence of Freire's work. What is very, very problematic within the academic context is that we're very mental expectations, very cognitive mental expectations. And that is very, very difficult for scholars of color. It's very difficult for scholars who are working class, who come not from a privileged context, who have had to struggle in order to be able to even find themselves sitting at the table of any sort of influence. And so the consequence is that part of what I've been trying to understand is to what extent or in what ways have Paulo Freire's work been absolutely crucial, particularly to folks of color in the United States. So how did it come about? What was it about Freire's work that was so absolutely important to the struggle in the United States? And from that vantage point, because that's the vantage point that I know. I mean, it's a knowledge that is not just, gotten from books, but is a knowledge that has been both lived, studied, and thought about philosophy, bringing the philosophy, the logical dimensions, the pedagogical dimensions, and trying to make some sense of the reality. Many times when we read about issues related to Freire and pedagogy of the press, the tendency has been to look at that work, first of all, from a more privileged standpoint. So it's usually people who are wanting to help the oppressed, who are writing about pedagogy of the oppressed. And some would say that Paulo, to some extent, comes from that context, although he, in fact, lived in poverty at a certain point in his life. So you can, each person is going to have their particular perspective. And that part of the struggle is that within a very academic environment, the tendency is to look for a kind of systematic understanding of Freire, or any systematic understanding conceptually, and to expect it to somehow be very linear. And at the same time, people want to talk about cultural differences, or people want to talk about inclusion, or people want to say that that we're creating a democratic context for all people to come to the table. The problem is that when that's said, it's often not engaged with the fact that it's still coming from a very Western European standpoint, even within the United States. And so there's ways of constructing knowledge, there's philosophical assumptions related to knowledge that are part and parcel of what goes on. In many ways, what Freire's work did in the 60s, in the late 60s, early 70s, especially within the United States, is that it provided for folks of color, especially for folks that were more radical and who were trying to push back the hegemony of the United States, were trying to fight back not only class issues, but questions of racism and sexism and other forms of inequality, was that Freire's work was naming the dialectic of the oppressed oppressor. Now, there's many who would like to say, well, really, who's really oppressed and who's the oppressor? Well, what I've discovered in my life is the only people that ask those kind of questions, ideologically and philosophically, are those that have never experienced oppression. And so there's a tendency to continue a kind of bourgeois conversation related to issues that have to do with inequality and issues that have to do with oppression within communities and all forms of oppression. The other piece that has been important in terms of Freire's work is that he brought, to a certain extent, some principles that we could hold on to and that we could engage with that would help us to think about issues of community empowerment, that could help us to begin to think about questions of self-determination. Even his ability to engage the question of violence in a way that was dialectical, that understood, for example, that issues of violence that we had to deal with the intentionality of violence, which is a very, very difficult piece at times when you're dealing within communities, that there was a sense that the violence that is perpetrated on people who are oppressed is very, very different than the violence that is born out of communities who are struggling to change the conditions in their lives. And so as a consequence, he gave words to many of the dynamics and the realities that were going on in our communities and some of the ways that people were struggling and moving on. In many ways, Freire's work also brought a different ethic, a sense of ethics, but a sense of ethics that was significant within the pedagogical experience, but understanding pedagogy, not only within the classroom, but understanding pedagogy as life. So that in fact, rather than thinking that it was just about what we did in the classroom, that we had to begin to look at our lives and to think about to what extent did what we do in the classroom manifest itself in the way that we lived. So it was a very, very different way of thinking of education. Education did not end the moment the students left the classroom, nor did education end the moment the teacher stepped out of the classroom. So part of what that then demanded was a coherence. And one of the interesting things for me in the United States, it may be different for you, it may be that here you're much more engaging of this question of coherence. What does it mean to be politically coherent? What does it mean to be pedagogically coherent? That what we find in the United States are often very liberal perspectives where certain rhetoric that sounds transformative is engaged, but is engaged in a way that actually ends up reifying the very same values, objectifying communities, impoverished communities, that continues to bring forth a kind of reductionist perspective. And as a consequence, what we find is that rather than being able to move forth a revolutionary project in education and communities, what happens is, in fact, we're constantly stalled by the ways in which people talk about what is going on in communities. So part of my work right at the moment, this is some new work that I'm trying to get a handle on, is to try to think about what does it mean then if we're going to create a leadership, a way of leading within communities and within schools that truly is going to